I mean, when I made my first film, my aunt, Dana, who studied film, she didn't go into making films, probably a smart move for sanity reasons, but
She's smarter than all of us.
that's right. But she said to me, whatever you budget for your first film, double it. Double it, because you're going to be so far off that you'll be better off doubling it. And it's true. My first film cost literally double, and it was a very micro budget movie. So, it wasn't like a $500,000 movie that became $1 million movie or anything weird like that. But it was definitely like, oh yeah, it did. It cost me twice as much because I didn't have a line producer. I didn't understand all those little things add up. I was in my late 20s. I was like, whatever, it'll be fine. It's just pizza. It's just this, it's just that. And then suddenly you're like, wow, look at my credit card bill. So, and I was prepared for that. And I think that, and you can disagree with this, but I think when people are starting out, you should at least in your head think I could go 30% over rather than 10%, because until you get good at it and used to budgeting and used to what can happen on set, like the unthinkable happens all the time, you're going to be much further off, right, than 10%. That's a very small margin.
Yeah, I mean, it does make a difference if it's 10% of a $500,000 budget, that's a whole different world than 10% of a $50,000 budget for this, so like if you have $50,000, yes, I think you need to have, and I've actually had this conversation with a couple of producers, really great producers, before signing on to really, like tiny projects. Like I was like, look, I mean, I could put a 10% contingency in this, but I hope you have a credit card somewhere in your back pocket, because we could blow through that in like one day.
Right.
And they were like, yeah, like if it comes to that, like, and we're like 2/3 of the way through and we're on fumes, I can add supplement. But, obviously they don't want to do that. But yeah, I mean, I do think, yes, if you're trying to do a project and you're like, the smaller the budget of the project, the more you should try to set aside in contingency. It's tricky because it can get to the point where you're like, it just doesn't seem like you're ever going to have enough money to make the movie or the web series or the short film. And so you have to kind of, if you find that you are, and that is actually one reason to get, to maybe hire somebody to do the budget if you feel like you're really too close to the project to do the budget yourself. Or, one thing you can do is, before I made my first film, I was trying to get another film off the ground that didn't come off. And honestly, it was probably better that it didn't, because it was too big of film for a first time filmmaker. I was trying to raise about $500,000, which back in the 90s was not as much as you'd think, because we're shooting on film back then. So a lot of that money went to just film.
Yeah.
I did my own budget. I did a couple drafts of it based on the best research I could do, but then I gave it to a real line producer who then like took it apart and said,
took out their red pen and wrote all over it.
Oh yeah.
Got a big F.
It was a big humble pie lesson for me. But, it was great because, and there were a bunch of people who helped me out early on in my career with stuff like that, who I had nothing to offer them in return, except sometimes I paid them some money, but like most of the time it was just straight up favor. Or friend of a friend kind of thing.
But then you are now paying that forward to people. Like I know with me, you've given me, but like with me, you've given me huge discounts on what it would cost to do a budget. You've done that for other people, I'm sure. Not that I'm promoting your services for low budget, everybody. And we don't promote services on here anyway, because this is just free advice.
Right.
But you're giving free advice right now that I think a lot of people don't hear. And then they do come out. I've heard of people, horror stories of being so in debt, it's like worse than their school debt, and there's no way out of it. Like I've heard of people declaring bankruptcy because they went and made a film, and like unfortunately and fortunately, if you're a real true indie filmmaker, once you're making that film, as you know from being on the other side, you're not going to stop. It doesn't matter. Oh, I haven't paid my bills. I have no money to eat. My dog is starving. Oh, well, we got to make the movie. Here's my card. I'm going to max it out. And that's really bad. You need to have a plan. Like, even if you're going to charge your card, like my first feature, I knew I was going to have to use my card. I also had a plan of how I would pay it off, partly, if you set up your tax stuff right, and we won't go into all that because that's like a whole other thing, but just setting yourself up properly to get money back that you're entitled to legally if you set yourself up as an LLC, as an S corp, blah blah blah. And also a plan to, okay, so for the next year and a half, I'm just going to be working and editing at night, and I'm not going to have a life because I won't be able to afford to, right? And it's a huge sacrifice if you're going to do that, and you have to be prepared for it. And so I think it's great that you're explaining this to everybody, because it's not to deter anybody from making a film, but it's like you're saying, you didn't do that first film. That film got put aside, and you went on to do a different film that I'm guessing was a more manageable budget and a more manageable project.
Yeah. Well, what happened was, you know, I was at the, I think the script, it was my second feature script. And so I think the writing quality just wasn't quite there. And it was based on my senior thesis project in school. So I think I was just too close to it to see the flaws in it. And so there were issues with the script. So the other thing that happened was I wrote more stuff, bigger budget stuff, stuff and just that practice of writing more made me a better writer. Also, digital video came along and really, to revolutionize the landscape for people at the low budget end. So suddenly, instead of making like a $500,000 movie could then be made for much less.
Yeah, probably half.
Yeah, half of that. And I wrote a script that was based, it was much more contained to begin with, and that I felt like I could make for my producer, and I felt like we could make that for like maybe about $55K.
Yeah.
We did get some investors, and we put the rest of the money in ourselves. We did have a sort of payback plan. I've always had other ways of making a living, both in the film business. Like, so, when I'm directing, I also have the backup of being a line producer, or I also teach, or until very recently, I taught production management, and I also work as a software developer. So which is totally outside of the industry, and write articles and stuff, which sometimes gets me a little money. So there's lots of, if you have other ways of making a living, that makes, that can give you like a little bit of a safety net, that makes it a lot less scary to go put your own money on the line. But yeah, if you don't have that and you're going to make a project, and you are going to be putting your own money into it, you should absolutely, invest a little bit in making sure that that budget that you've created is realistic. So if you can't afford a line producer to do a budget for you, maybe ask somebody like me who's been around for a while, who you might know through connections, to look over your budget.
What does it cost just to forget having somebody on set doing line producing, which obviously would be good? What does it cost to have somebody run a budget? Is it $500? Is it $5,000? Is there a huge range of what the average rate is? And again, I'm not asking your rate, so make it a range. And
I mean, it's, the range is anywhere from 500 at the low end, to 2,000 to 3,000. And I've seen quotes above that. What I've just described to you, I've been doing this for a while, but it still takes me like a few days to do a breakdown. And that's before I've done any actual budgeting. So, depending on the complexity of the script, how many scenes there are, it could take me a few days just to do the breakdown. Then I have to do some kind of schedule. Then I have to do the budget, which usually involves at least some research, because, you just don't know the prices of everything in your head. If there's travel involved, if you're shooting in 2 different locations in 2 different states, post-production workflow is different for every project. All those things you need to do some research. And then you have to do like maybe 2 revisions on top of that. So you send the budget back to the producers and they freak out because it's too high a number. And then you work out, like it almost always is, but I'd rather do that than like, it's always better to over budget and then you can trim back than to under budget. That's my feeling. And then, and so that process can take weeks to a month.
That's actually a very low rate.
It depends. I mean, because if you are just doing that like full time and doing nothing else, you can crank out a budget fairly quickly. It usually takes me longer because I've always got another job, and I kind of when I'm talking to a producer, I'm trying to be fair to them and figure out how much of a time commitment I can make and how flexible they are. So like the more flexibility you have, as independent filmmakers, your main, you usually don't have a lot of money, but you do have time. Even though it doesn't feel like it, like you can trade time for money a little bit.
Sure. I do that with editing all the time. I'm actually editing someone short. I won't say who, because I don't want to talk about their budget publicly, but they're paying me basically a third of my rate a day, but it's a 5-minute short. I really want to do it. And even though it'll probably take me 2 or 3 days to get them a cut, I told them I need a month because I might do 4 hours one day, 4 hours another day, because other things are going to take precedent over doing that. But because they're willing to be flexible, I get to work on a fun indie wacky project because it is a crazy script, and they get to still eat dinner and everybody wins.
Yeah. So I mean, that's one thing is like, if you don't need the budget right away, you can probably negotiate a lower rate with the line producer. But usually, if somebody calls me and tells me they need a budget this week, I'm going to charge them a lot more because then I have to put everything else on hold in order to do that.